get us started here at high noon today. Thank you all for joining. My name is Genine Coleman. I'm the Executive Director of Ordnance Council, and I'm honored to be one of the co-principal investigators on this study. We're all gathered today to share with you the members of our research team and our project personnel, and we're going to be going through a presentation with each of our researchers presenting on their specific scope and the project as a whole. So we'll take the first hour or so to go through the presentation, and then we'll open to Q&A. We do have a Q&A feature on the Zoom, so feel free to use that, and we'll answer questions as we go. And then when we get to the Q&A portion of our webinar, we'll invite folks to use the raise hand function, and we'll take questions in order and look forward to having that part of our discussion with you all. And just a couple of logistics here. We do ask that you please remain muted through the duration of the presentation. And when we get to Q&A, please try and keep your questions concise so that we have more room for as many folks as possible to engage. And so I'm going to go ahead and start our slide presentation, and then we'll present from there. And the webinar is being recorded, and we're going to share the recording after it posted to our website. And so feel free to share it with friends who are not able to join us today. Great, so I am happy to pass it to my friend and colleague, Khalil Ferguson, to introduce himself and get us going here.
Yes, thank you, Genine. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon at this point. My name is Khalil Ferguson. I am the president of the United Corva Alliance. We are a 501c3 organization, a legal aid organization based in Sacramento, California. We do records clearing work as well as other legal aid services that are growing. We are happy to work with the team that we have here, along with Ordnance Council and their regional partners as well on this. The United Corva Alliance really works with our urban communities in San Diego, the Bay Area. I'm actually here in San Francisco right now, and Sacramento and other parts of California in this. And one of the reasons why we thought it was important to join forces and to collaborate on this very important study was the result of our deepened connection between urban communities and rural communities as it relates to the war on drugs and the history of supply and demand. So as we go into the overview today, we want to keep in mind the history of our two communities and how we are working together to really have a comprehensive review and study of legacy genetics in California, pre-legalization, and then let's take it through phases: pre-legalization, through after medical use, and now recreational use. So there's a background of the study herein. Everyone on this team is comprised of researchers, academics, community-oriented folks, scientists, and we were awarded $2.7 million for the next 2 years to conduct legacy genetics, oral history, and really just tell a comprehensive history of legacy genetics here in California.
Great, thank you, Khalil. I really appreciate you, and I'm really excited to be working with you on this project. So I'd like to speak to the overarching research questions and objectives of the research. So this research priority was put forward by the Department of Cannabis Control and really guided the design of our research study. And the two research questions that we're seeking to answer are, what are California's cannabis legacy genetics? And, as the project title states, it's really about the community that's stewarding these genetics and the regional community as well. And so the second research question, what are legacy cultivation regions? And so supporting those research questions and the objectives we're really striving for are to establish community-driven plant cultivar definitions and documentation through herbaria to protect cannabis plant diversity and ensure that cultivation communities are acknowledged for their breeding work and can leverage these resources for their own agricultural futures. And Dr. Kuntz is going to speak to that work and really look forward to hearing from her. Secondly, to understand the connection between social and genetic history of cannabis plants in legacy cultivation regions. And last, to develop, evaluate, and refine a methodology that serves as a model for working with legally marginalized and often underserved communities to document and preserve historic cannabis cultivars in California and beyond. And this really speaks to the overall research methodology in employing community-based participatory research, which Dr. Plum is going to present on here shortly. And we'd love to acknowledge our amazing research and project personnel team. So folks will introduce themselves as we go, but just to sort of put it forward for everyone here, we're very lucky to be joined by Principal Investigator Dr. Dominic Corva from California State Polytechnic University in Humboldt. Again, I'm Executive Director of Origins Council, Genine Coleman, Co-Principal Investigator. We're also joined by Dr. Todd Holmes, historian with the Oral History Center at the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley. Dr. Eleanor Kuntz, co-founder of Candor, which is the world's first cannabis herbarium, and co-founder and CEO of LeafWorks, a genomics and plant science company. Dr. Marj Plum, nationally recognized expert in community-based participatory research. Khalil, who you just met. And Hannah Nelson is the Research, Education, and Development Program Advisor for Origins Council. Sam De La Paz is our Communications and Community Engagement Advisor. Ross Gordon serves as our Research and Policy Analyst on this project. And Richard Mendelson is our Advisor on Appalachians Law and Policy. And Courtney Billy is our Project and Events Coordinator. And so with that, I'm happy to pass it to you, Marj.
Great, thank you so much, Genine, and welcome everybody to the webinar. My name is Marj Plum. I'm a community advocate and a nonprofit leader. I actually got my doctorate in public health just because I wanted government workers and public policy people to have to call me Dr. Plum. But you don't have to do that. You can call me Marj or Professor Plum if you want to play a game of Clue. Next slide. So one of the really exciting aspects of this project, of this research project, was that it was conceived of and developed around using community-based participatory research. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. And the approach is really to make sure that that the science that's done is reflective of community knowledge and community input. Go ahead and next slide. So what is community-based participatory research? It basically, in the context of traditional research, CBPR was created as a way to make sure that research was done, within the context of community knowledge. And this was developed in a variety of different ways. Some of it was definitely in reaction to what had become kind of the predominant research model, which was that the researcher needed to, at all costs, always remain neutral, not be a part of the community that they were researching, and not have the community that they were researching be a part of the research study. Legions of researchers were basically told, you have to stay back, you have to stay out of the community, or your research will lack credibility. Go ahead, Genine. Next slide. One of the challenges, or there's many challenges of traditional research, this is one of my saddest but best stories. I was asked to go down to Nigeria, where a study was being conducted by a US scientist who was trying to figure out why women in 3 villages in Nigeria were dying in childbirth and not getting to a hospital. The hospitals were roughly, 45 minutes away. And so they did a survey and they asked women in the villages to fill out the survey. And the survey results showed that about 75 to 80% of those surveyed, when they answered the question, do you own a car, said yes. I'd like anyone to help point out where the cars are parked in the villages in Nigeria. So there was a question, well, if all of them own cars, why aren't they getting to the hospital? And so I went down and had some conversations with the women in the villages, and they actually all laughed because they said, well, 100% should have answered yes, because every village owns 1 car. And so you can see why, without community input into how a survey is phrased, what the survey questions are, what you're looking at, how that can sometimes lead to very misleading results in research. Go ahead, Genine. So what is community-based participatory research? We see it as an equal partnership between community members and research scientists. And they work together at every step of the research project, from identifying what the research question is, developing the research plan, carrying out the research, interpreting the results, and disseminating the results. And the team here has been doing that and developed the research project together and the research questions together with the researchers and the community leaders being a part of that creation. Next slide. So this current project has 4 basic kind of components to it. One is the research team, which includes the PIs, but also includes other key personnel, other project workers, students and interns, volunteers that meet and are part of helping to make sure that the research goes along. The co-PIs, and there are both community and academic co-PIs. There will be a community advisory board, and they will give key input and have specific decision-making powers. And then there's always other stakeholders, so other organizations, funders, businesses, other universities. Next slide. The benefits are, it benefits the community, it answers important questions, it helps the community develop research and evaluation skills, it provides funding for community members to be able to participate, it builds grant and project management capacity, and provides data for advocacy and change. I've evaluated community-based participatory research and have found that those communities that are part of these types of studies actually take the results of the studies and go to policymakers and go to the government to make changes that are important and that come from the research because they understand what they've just studied. Researchers like to work in this format because it provides a more ethical access to the communities, helps to use community knowledge to create more relevant research, increases participation. I evaluated a CBPR project that had 100 participants, and they reported that 99 stayed with the research for 4 years, which is really kind of unusual. Any of the researchers on the call would agree that having 99 out of 100 people stay with the research project for 4 years is pretty unusual. And when I talked to them, they said, well, actually all 100 stayed, but they felt like nobody would believe them. But that's what you get when you have community participating in a study like this. So welcome everybody. This is going to be a ride for everybody to participate in this, and we look forward to working with you. I think now I bounce it back to Genine and Khalil, maybe?
Yeah, thank you, Marj. Well, I'll take the opportunity to introduce my organization a little more thoroughly. So Origins Council's federally tax-exempt 501c4. Nonprofit research, education, and advocacy organization. Our mission is dedicated to sustainable rural economic development within cannabis producing regions and establishing nationally and internationally recognized, legally defensible, standards-based geographic indication systems for cannabis. And we're really excited for this research project and how we anticipate it will really support farmers that are petitioning for appellations as the California Department of Food and Agriculture stands up their cannabis appellations program, which will be the first in the world. The way that our organization is structured, we've got 2 program tracks. One pertains to our research, education, and development work. The other pertains to our political advocacy work. And we are partnered with 6 regional trade associations who represent licensed and hoping to be licensed cultivators from the historic cannabis producing regions in California. And so we're very pleased to be partnered with these organizations also in the study and to have their support and reach in terms of supporting our outreach and engagement with the community at large. And so again, you know, very honored to be one of the community-based organizations on this community-based participatory research project. It's been a vision of our organization to pursue this type of research since our founding in 2019. And happy to pass it to you, Khalil, if there's anything you'd like to add about United Corn Lines.
No, thank you, Genine. I covered UCA's background. Happy to reiterate, some of these services and the positions of the communities that we serve and how it connects to this work along with our advocacy, not just here, but also in the state legislature, and sometimes as it overlaps in local government as well, between rural farmers and small urban equity operators, or just small operators in the cannabis industry as well. So that's why we're here, to make sure we can ensure that this program or the study reaches all parts of the cannabis industry here in California.
Thanks, Khalil. So really want to acknowledge that the DCC request for grant proposals had a few requirements in it, and one of the requirements was for the study to be designed to include a culturally sensitive community outreach and education and engagement plan. And we really appreciate the DCC's sensitivity around the topic of genetic resources and the community's intellectual property, and the need to be very sensitive to legacy community in terms of those that have been impacted by the war on drugs historically. So central to our approach to really meet this mandate of the funding agency is to take the community-based participatory research approach. It's a culturally sensitive approach, and we've included an education component in addition to the outreach and engagement that really prioritizes community engagement. So there's several ways in which this is being approached. We've done internal training with the research team and project personnel regarding community-based participatory research. Khalil designed and led a diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice training for the project personnel. Hannah Nelson also led a training regarding engaging war on drug impacted communities. And so that really created some foundational footing for us as a research and project personnel team to be engaging with the community at large. We're now in the process of having some focus group meetings to help establish criteria for a community advisory board. That community advisory board is going to include 13 members of the community who have specific expertise relevant to legacy genetics. So we'll be looking for those with expertise in the legacy producing community with genetics and breeding and cultivation. We're really excited to be onboarding the community advisory board, which will be advising us through the duration of the project moving forward and really guiding all of the researchers at every step of the process here. We have a project website that we're just about to launch our updated version that provides detailed up-to-date information about the project. And as it's developed, access to educational materials, research data, project deliverables. So really excited to promote our updated website, which has considerably more information on it. So that's coming very shortly, I think by next week. And then we're hosting and recording these webinars to enable the research team to dialogue with the community members to make sure that you meet all of us and understand our background and how the project is structured, and really get into the details of the research objectives, the methods, and the specific research tracks that are moving forward. And then moving into the new year, we're really excited to be hosting in-person regional workshops with our partner organizations to support experiential learning and enable collaborative data collection. And Khalil, would you mind speaking to the program evaluation piece?
Yeah, sorry, it was quiet where I'm at and got loud as I'm at a conference here and it's that everyone actually standing for lunch. But the program evaluation will be ongoing and performed throughout the research, ensuring that we have community input, as Genine mentioned, and we're maintaining that balance between academic input and community input to ensure, we are reflecting, clearly reporting and reflecting the history of legacy genetics, in our research. But part of that, and I know Dominic will touch on that later, will be some of the deliverables, will be the production of a CBPR model for us to take and use in different studies for the cannabis industry, or just for other equity-related studies regarding oral history. But this ongoing research and criteria, quantitatively and qualitatively, will result in a community-led publication throughout the study that will be peer-reviewed and posted to journals. And I know Dominic has one or two, I think maybe a few that he's going to produce. But there's going to be a bunch of literature coming out of this study that will be reliant on community input, accurate community input, which is why we have the community partners here in, and will reflect the community's outlook and perspective of the legacy genetics history here in California.
Great, thanks, Cliff. So with that, happy to pass it on to Todd.
Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Todd Holmes. I'm a historian with the Oral History Center at UC Berkeley. And as such, I am the historian on the team. So my principal role in this research will be conducting about 100 hours of oral history interviews in the communities that we're working with. And so today, in this presentation, I just want to provide a brief overview of actually what is oral history and how that process was going to work in the study, as well as the contributions that it will bring to both the research as well as the communities that are involved. Next slide, please. So before I do that, let me do a bit of an introduction on myself, but more importantly, on the Oral History Center itself. The center is a special research unit of the Bancroft Library at Berkeley. And the Bancroft Library is the main special collections library and archive, not just at Berkeley, but actually one of the main special collection archives in the West. So our center was founded in 1953, which in the nerdy universe of academics makes us the second oldest oral history center in the US. And we oversee and maintain one of the largest oral history collections. Over 5,000 volumes are currently now in our holdings. And volumes are the transcripts of the interviews produced. So those interviews range in length from anywhere from 1 to 2 hours to over 50 hours. As a historian, my job there at the center is actually rather unique. I don't teach classes. I don't grade papers. I actually really don't even communicate much with students on campus. I am one of 5 PhD historians there at the center, and we run projects all year long, and we run projects nationwide. I specifically focus on California, as do a lot of our projects. That's kind of our backyard. And collectively, we produce probably about over 500 hours of interviews each year. And that's in addition to other nerdy historian things, such as writing articles and books, producing podcasts, documentaries, and multimedia exhibits, and all that kind of fun stuff. A little bit about myself. I'm a lifelong Californian. So the only time I haven't lived in California are the 6 years I had to spend in graduate school on the East Coast. And I was fortunate enough when that was done to actually come right back, and which is a good thing because I specialize in the study of California in the West, or I like to just say all things Californian. I got into actually researching California cannabis through those kind of steps of I specialized in studying California politics for nearly 2 decades. And when you study California politics, you quickly learn like, well, to understand politics, I had to study California business. And then after you do that for a while, you realize, well, to really understand California business, I got to study California agriculture. And you can only spend a little bit of time in California agriculture till you stumble into cannabis. And so I've been in this type of research for quite a bit, and I'm really happy to join this team. Next slide, please. So what is actually this oral history that I spend my time doing? Oral history is the collection of memories and personal commentaries of historical significance through recorded interviews. So this is a methodology that historians developed probably over the last half century or more in the attempt really to diversify the archive and our understanding of the past. So history is actually written through the archive. So historians such as myself will sit in there for many months researching at places like the Bancroft, going through documents, photographs, printed material, all things that were preserved there. Now, if you think about over centuries, what things are being preserved, whose documents are being preserved, who's actually being covered in the newspaper. It largely, this produced a view and a historical record that really covers, it's very top down, meaning only that upper sliver of the, of society is really focused. So politicians, industrial business leaders, diplomats, wealthy families. And this top-down view of the historical record largely was predominantly white, predominantly male, and largely focused on the upper class. And so all of which excluded vast segments of our society, the working class, women, communities of color, farmers, and to our point today, cannabis communities. So oral history is a method that us historians began to use in the attempt to really capture and record those often excluded, those experiences, those voices that have been excluded from the historical record, in the attempt to diversify the archive and therefore diversify our understanding and documentation of the past to try to make history a more accurate reflection of the world we actually live in. So here in this project, I'll be conducting about 100 hours, again, of oral history interviews, which is really one of the very few ways that we can document the history of California cannabis communities and their genetic legacy. Next slide, please. So how are we going to select those we interview in this project? And I'm really happy first to reassure you, it's not Todd's decision. We're actually keeping with the CBPR model, our community-based participatory research. We're actually putting a lot of this back into the community's hands. So one of the great things I love about oral history is it reminds me as a historian how much I don't know, meaning that a lot of the stuff that I capture in my projects that hasn't been written about yet. It hasn't been recorded yet. And this is obviously one of those projects that fits within that vein, meaning the community's voice was going to be vital in this process because the communities themselves are the experts. They know the key people whose stories and experience would best represent their respective communities and contribute to this project. And so we're going to incorporate the community's voice in two ways in this selection process. First, we're going to use nomination forms, which will be on our website. And so through community outreach, we're going to be asking communities to get involved and submit nominations. And those nominations can be for themselves as well as anybody else in the community that they think that would be worth considering. And there's no limit on the number of nominations one could submit. And these are going to be anonymous. So we're going to take those nominations and particularly all of the information that's in there, and we're going to take the name out, and then we're going to put that into a selection process with our community advisory board. I have cannabis advisory board on there just because I think, as community advisory board, CAB is not often in many projects I actually get to say, well, it's actually also a cannabis advisory board. And so that's what they're also going to be working on. These are members from the community who are going to work with the research team in that selection process. And that's how we're going to get to our interview selection. Next slide, please. And so once we have our list, now oral history is a very collaborative process. So this doesn't mean I just go and I make an appointment with that interviewee and I set up my camera and hit record. Actually, the interviewee is a collaborator in these interviews. And so their voice they're going to have voice will be key to this entire process, from what is discussed to also what is made public. So from multiple meetings before our interview, we're going to chart out those areas of discussion together. We're going to identify the areas and the points that they want to make, the stories that they want to tell, the experiences that they really want to document. And in that process, interviewees are also allowed to highlight areas that they don't want to be discussed. And this is really key in that you know, it's a collaboration, and therefore there's no gotcha questions. This is what kind of differentiates oral history from journalism, right? So it's well prepared, very very laid out. And from those discussions, then I go and do my research and I produce outlines. And so for each interview session that we have, there's going to be an outline, which I like to call roadmaps. So we have a guide of what's going to be discussed and where we're going to go in that. And then, so after I make that, the interviewee, that's going to be sent to the interviewee to review. And so the interviewee gets to review, they get to edit however they see fit, and then finally approve those outlines. Those outlines are our roadmap for our interviews. So again, there's no surprises, there's no curveballs, there's no gotcha questions. They know exactly what we're going to discuss and where we're going to go in those interviews. Next slide, please. And that hopefully builds trust. So meaning that if it's not on the outline, it's not discussed. And that's something that I do when interviewing governors, senators, politicians, business leaders, artists. And I think so that is a very key point to all how oral history works. So there's no surprises. And our goal really is, when we sit down, I want the interviewee to be comfortable and confident that they know exactly where we're going to go and what's going to be discussed. Next slide, please. So after our interview, those interview recordings will be transcribed, and those transcriptions will come back and be a double review of those transcripts. So I'm going to do a light review and edit of those, fixing errors, flagging statements, these kind of things. But then the interviewee, again, they have a hand in that process, and they get to review their transcript, and they can edit however they see fit. Now, we try to keep edits as close to the original recordings as possible. No need to rewrite history, right? But they do have the choice that they can actually edit however they see fit. And we also have processes such as placing seals or redactions within the transcript itself to, you know, if that is also desired. And so therefore then that, again, only that approved transcript and that final transcript will be made public. So again, the interviewee has a voice and a hand in the entire process of what's going to be, you know, not just discussed, but also what will be the final product and put out publicly when complete. Next slide. And then talk about diversifying the archive. So those transcripts go into the Bancroft Library holdings. There will be a hardbound version there in their holdings, but we'll also make an online version of that transcript available, fully available to the public. And the video recordings themselves will be held in our collection, but we currently do not make those publicly available except on request. And again, there's if the interviewee would like to withhold those or not make them publicly available, those kind of accommodations also can be made. During the Q&A, happy to answer any questions about copyright. The one thing I will say is there's a variety of options available to our interviewees on the type of copyright that they want. Copyright for us is that all of these transcripts are put out for free for an educational use. So copyright largely for the University of California is safeguarding against somebody else trying to sell the oral histories for profits, such as Amazon. Need to say, whatever option of the copyright that the interviewee chooses to hold, they still maintain full use of their words in interviews however they see fit. And the same thing also goes with image rights. But again, all sorts of options are there, and any additional provisions, if needed, are available. Next slide. So these, when done, all of these interviews will create the California Cannabis Oral History Collection at UC Berkeley. It'll be the first of its kind, and it will actually finally place California cannabis into the historical record. But what I like the most about oral history is, particularly in this venue, is it's going to be a history that's actually told by the community members themselves. And it'll be there preserved for future generations. For the research project, the oral history will be combined with our ethnographic interviews and our scientific work. And all three together, again, is very first of its kind collaborative study to help trace that genetic legacy of California's cannabis communities and serve as a basis for the communities themselves, and not just to know their history, but also to and preserve and document their history, but also to use it as a foundation in trying to apply for intellectual property rights. And so this is something that oral history has played a role with, particularly when we look at California wine. And we're hoping that could be that kind of resource as well for our cannabis communities in California, and recognizing that legacy and heritage of our cultivators. So that's enough from me. And I think now we're going to turn it to our team scientist, Dr. Eleanor Kuntz.
Hi, it's really always wonderful to hear everyone speak about their different components. So my name is Eleanor Kuntz. I am a population and evolutionary geneticist by trade, and my company LeafWorks really specializes in botanical identity using genetics as a tool for identification. And so we do this across natural products, and we deal with a multitude of botanical plants, cannabis, of course, being one of our favorites in the mix. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we're going to approach this problem and plug into this project. Next slide, please. So I want to first go over the major goals of the work. So there's three major goals within the science side of things. And the first major one is to document legacy California cannabis genetic plant diversity. So the way that we do this in general is through the creation of herbariums, which document vouchered plants. I'll get into the specifics of what that means in just a moment, and to understand the history of those plants that we're documenting. That is often in an agricultural system like this, an interaction between the plant and a human. So it's a very interesting intersection of the work that Todd is doing with history and genetics. So it's really fun how these different topics are coming together within this project. So once we have an understanding of this history and the diversity of plants, we really need to work towards codifying naming systems to establish cultivar strain varietal names. So this is really important because we have to be able to communicate with each other what plants we're talking about. And so it's understanding what are the phenotypic boundaries that are held within a certain named plant, and to understand what is the breeding history or evolutionary history of that plant to help contextualize those phenotypic boundaries and the boundaries of the plant itself. Once we understand what's in a name, we can really move on to understand how is genetic diversity distributed within and between communities and regions. Next slide, please. So we're really good at doing this as humans, breaking things down into different categories. And we have a really long history of various tools that we use to understand how overall plant diversity is structured, and then specifically how diversity within groups. And so on the right-hand side, you see a picture of Brassica olearia. So this is the common brassica, which has of course been bred into numerous crops that we're all very familiar with. The brassicas are an amazingly diverse group given they're all the same species. And so this is the kind of detail that we're trying to capture. What is making a cabbage look like a cabbage versus a cauliflower, even though it is the same species? So what are the different varietals and different types we can parse out of cannabis? So next slide. So we all know that cannabis is very diverse. So there's diversity across every aspect that you would like to talk about with cannabis, from flower morphology, chemical profiles, plant physiology, and different morphologies. This can be agricultural traits such as height and yield, and then also more unseen diversity such as pathogen resistance and susceptibility. So how do we really look at all of these different traits and understand the diversity in cannabis? Next slide. So the way that botanists approach this problem is really to use plant vouchers. It's a very fundamental tool in botany. It's very low barrier to entry, and it's fundamental to plant definition. So if you were to find a new species of plant or to breed a new varietal, one of the first things that you're going to do is voucher or make a plant pressing of that organism so that you have a physical, tangible reference that you can refer back to collectively to understand what that thing, that taxon, that unit of diversity is. Next slide, please. Plant vouchers are held in herbaria. So an herbarium is really just a storehouse for all of these different plant vouchers. They are, I'm sorry, this is. The printer is going off. It's going to get really loud. We have herbaria all over the world. The largest herbaria is at one of the largest herbaria in the United States is the Missouri Botanical Garden. They have special collections depending on what herbaria that you're at. And this is really just the storehouse for these materials. Next slide. So as we dive into the specific goals, will work with Candor Herbarium, which is the first herbarium solely dedicated to the documentation of cannabis, to really codify what traits do we need to look at when we're writing descriptions of cannabis plants, right? It's going to be different than hemp. It's going to be different than apples. And so really working with the community to capture that information so that those pieces of information are linked to those vouchers themselves. Next slide. So this is an example of the work that Candor Herbarium does. This is the simple press, and you take these leaves and pieces of plants and you press them. Let's go next slide. So why do we care about documentation of what a cultivar name is? One of the most important things to be able to do to have translatable science is to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. So if we know that we have a plant that's really special for certain reasons, and we're going to include it in, let's say, a clinical trial for a specific pathology, we want to make sure that every individual within that group is using the same material. So we want to make sure the name actually means something. And when you dive into cannabis, you have a really big issue where the names that are in the dispensary on jars are not consistent to the plants that are inside those products. This also happens at nurseries. And a lot of this is unintentional, but it makes it very difficult to have common dialogue about a particular plant's value or what that plant is useful for, whether you're speaking to an agricultural use, like it's really good because it's pest resistant, or a medical use, it's very important because it has a certain chemical profile, or just a recreational use where you have an individual that likes a certain blend of chemicals and a certain aroma profile, and they want to make sure every time they're engaging with that plant with a certain name, they're getting the same thing. It's also really important within a farmer outlook, because if you have consistent naming, then all of a sudden you can assign value. Either your farm or your organization is just better at growing that plant, so they make a higher quality product. It becomes very difficult to talk about quality when you're not talking about apples and apples. Next slide. And so this is some of the fun and beautiful work that the herbarium has done in starting to document cultivars from different organizations and different breeders to really codify what are the characteristics that hold these cultivars together. And so this is an example of Candor in the field doing work at a farm, and it's the kind of work that we will be engaging with for this project. Next slide. So cultivar definitions, I think a lot of people get overwhelmed. How do you start this process when there's potentially issues where people don't agree? How do you categorize something that is so diverse? I think it's really interesting to look towards roses. They make a very good parallel. It's also an exceptionally diverse group where there's a lot of heated opinions, and you just start somewhere. And so when you have the term cultivar, it really is referring to an assemblage of plants that are selected for certain desirable traits that are maintained during propagation. So cultivar doesn't, like, if you have a flowering plant that has certain characteristics, like it's very bitter, has a lot of limonene, and it is very compact. Those may be characteristics that are definitional to the cultivar, whereas the flower can vary. So that's something that's important to remember with the cultivar definition. It really is what the definition holds the boundaries of the phenotype or the characteristics of the plant. They don't have to be 100% identical in their characters. And so just to keep that in mind. And the next slide. And again, I just want to reiterate, like, why do we care about plant names? It's because we really need clear communication. Can't communicate if you're not talking about the same thing. And if you have an agricultural system where you want to have differentiated agricultural products, or something where it's not just like rice is a very good example. No one really buys rice based on the varietal. There's a few exceptions, like basmati is a category. There's like hundreds of varietals of basmati. So you don't buy rice based on the varietal. You buy rice based on a grading system, where it's a certain length, a certain color, and that'll give an A, B, or C grade. And that is a very challenging agricultural system. It's more of a commodity system where you can't really drive additional value based on the specialness of the cultivar. And so in cannabis, having very special characteristics of special plants drives this differentiated market, but that is really sits on a foundation of common definitions. This really extends into medicinal usage for cannabis. We don't test all of the chemicals that are in a plant. So if you have varietals that are really important for certain pathologies and positive outcomes, you really want to make sure you're getting the same plants, not just something that's very similar based on a very small subset of chemicals that are assayed. And then you also get into the considerations around IP and breeding and work that communities and individuals have done. You really need to have common language and common foundation so that you can move things forward to be able to gain IP from work that has been done. Next slide. I think the most interesting part of the work is the third portion, where once we can really dig into cannabis diversity and names, we can then start to really look at how is that genetic diversity distributed within and between communities and regions. And so it's a very interesting question that has implications for policy and also preservation strategies, and then also more long-term for germplasm improvement. And so if you find a picture where all communities have the same plants, don't expect that to happen, but then you have a very different strategy moving forward than if you find, oh, certain communities have very high diversity and other communities have lower diversity, or there's different diversity that's really held and maintained within different communities. You just have a different way of approaching those preservation and diversity strategies. Next slide. Is going on to Corva. So I am really excited to talk about genetics, and in the question and answer session, look forward to diving into any questions that you have regarding the work we're doing.
Thank you, Eleanor. I'm Dominic Corva. I am the Cannabis Studies Program Lead at Cal Poly Humboldt in the Department of Sociology. And my research scope addresses two elements of the research priority for which we were awarded. So these are also the goals up front of the work, right? So the narrative history and stories of the individuals associated with the creation and preservation of cannabis genetics in California that overlaps with what Todd's doing, but what I'm doing is different. I'm a political geographer by training, and my work is about places. We'll get into that in a second. And then also the proposal should review specifically how the prohibition and criminalization of cannabis cultivation impacted the overall findings of the research, but including but not limited to the diversity of cultivars and breeders. So my distinct scope deliverables are the publication of 2 academic journal articles that are geographic in scope. And next slide, please. So each distinct article, peer-reviewed article, asks these 2 questions. Well, one is focused on when and where in California were communities formed around the stewardship of cannabis genetics, breeding, and cultivation. And then the other one is when and where in the world did California plant stewards connect with other places in terms of genetics development and plant stewardship? So broadly speaking, my work is about putting on the record what it means to claim California legacy when it comes to cannabis, when of course we have a deep historical record of cannabis places around the world, starting with Central Asia. Many of you could probably come up with a number of places that might come to mind: Amsterdam, Barcelona, various parts of Africa, Latin America, and South Asia, India, for example, Bangladesh, and so forth. So this is a deep historical dive that intends to place essentially the emergence of California as a legacy weed place in a world historical context, which is really important because if we're throwing around the term legacy, we have to respect what has come before and other people around the world. So what I hope also is this serves as a model for other places to make claims. And so within that context, we're especially paying attention to how in the era of cannabis eradication and prohibition since the 1970s, did California become, in fact, one of those global places. And then the other article is really a different scale. So it's within California. How did that happen over time? From Santa Cruz to Humboldt to Nevada County to San Diego and beyond. So what I'm doing is sort of broader and more historical and really about places, but through the interviews of people. So next slide, please. What qualifies me to do this? So my professional credentials, I have a PhD in geography from the University of Washington on political economy of drug policy. I'm a professor at Cal Poly Humboldt, but really what qualifies me is 15 years of field experience, research, activism, and organizing in and with and as part of cannabis communities, especially in California, Oregon, and Washington, but also nationally and around the world. And then in particular, when it comes to really scholarship and research around what prohibition has had to do with things, 4 years of creating cannabis equity assessments across California, in which asking about the social context of community formation and impacts of law enforcement were central. Next slide, please. Where do I find information to answer these questions? Well, part of it's archival research, but I shout out to Christopher Carr, who I think is in the room. I think that his radio show slash podcast really clued me into the emergence of popular interest in the subject and the conversations that people have around them and what they had to say about communities and places. There are many other podcasts since I discovered Christopher's about 5 years ago that are doing this on an increasing basis. Shout out to Hash Church and any number of them. People are asking these questions already. And so I want to, honor that and listen to, the conversations that have already happened. Also, there is a scant academic literature, although in particular, the work that Rob Clark has done around cannabis evolution and ethnobotany with Mark Merlin, who's also a geographer, is inspirational in this regard. We are focusing upon a present in which people can speak about their histories rather than a past that is so deep that we have to deal with archaeology. This is an opportunity and a moment before these people go away to really learn about and be able to think about the historical context of how cannabis got around the world, especially in the context of funded efforts to prevent that. And so my interviews are ethnographic interviews of people with lived experience relevant to the research questions, as well as researchers who've done some research on the topic. These ethnographic interviews mean that I'm asking people about their life histories, but in particular, their life histories with the plant and how they were related to communities that really shaped places. So the ultimate story is about places rather than people. The default is anonymization with all interviews. This is not like Todd's oral history interviews that are ultimately on the end of it going to be, public and in video form. How anonymous people want it to be is ultimately going to be up to them. But the process is somewhat similar in that I'm doing about 100 distinct different interviews that are 90-minute interviews. And similar to Todd, there's transcription involved. There's a process of anonymization. There's the process of making sure people are okay with what's in the transcript. But on the end of it, this isn't a story about these people, even if their lives tell the story of places and communities. So next slide, please. So these are semi-structured interviews with people who are identified in 3 ways: from archival research, for example, from the robust network of people I've developed over 15 years and the conversations we've had about the subject at hand. This includes the people in my backyard here in Humboldt County, as well as the folks I've already worked with the assessments. And then also from, we need to remove an A from that, from people recruited by the community advisory boards that I believe, have been explained before, and Todd in particular, described a process that is quite similar in terms of the, anonymized process where people get recommended to do ethnographic interviews. So, yeah, next slide, please. So, part of this is we don't have all of them to start with. We have a fairly large amount of folks that I start with, and then we move from there based on recommendations that the people I interview think I should talk to, and this is going to be important for getting geographic breadth, in particular in California. I am, my particular immediate network is very Northern California. But we want to move out and around the state in particular. So we want to be able to use these different ways of getting to interviewees so that I can get to, a broader set of places, within California. So this is why it's a little bit different, is it's, deeply historical for one, and also we really have to do geographic breadth. And so for that to be fairly distributed, we have to use kind of a variety of approaches to getting to approximately 100 distinct interviewees. So that's me, and that's what I'm doing specifically. And I'm really happy to see the folks in the room today. And next slide. There we go.
Thanks, Dominic. I appreciate it. And we'll mention this later, but I just want to flag that our next webinar is going to be featuring Dominic and his scope, and that's coming up on Thursday, November 21st, and that'll be at noon. And registration is required for that, and so the link to register is up on our website now. So to close out the scope for the research project, we wanted to talk about the public policy and intellectual property protections component. This is a component of the research that Origins Council is leading on in partnership with the rest of the team. And we're looking specifically at how intellectual property and policy instruments can really support cultivators and breeders in stewarding their genetic diversity, protecting novel genetics. And I think the work that Eleanor is doing helps to really educate the community about what novel genetics are and what is really eligible for intellectual property protections versus what's already sort of held in the commons. And then the purpose really, to support not just the protection of the genetics, but also to advantage producers to commercially leverage both collective and individual genetic resources. Overall, the gestalt of the research is going to help to inform not just our educational webinars and a report about IP protections, and the commercialization of genetic resources, but an overall suite of policy recommendations to look at analyzing the impacts of the existing policy frameworks that we have for cannabis, which frankly are quite limited and stifled by Schedule I and the policy constructs that we're working under that flow down from that federal reality into our state and local policy frameworks, and looking at generally what's available for agriculture, what those frameworks, policy instruments, and intellectual property tools are that are available to commercial agriculture and also for personal growers, and really trying to create a suite of policy recommendations that helps to inform not just the state and the Department of Cannabis Control, other state agencies, and also nationally, how to really bridge that gap and move towards the normalization of cannabis as an agricultural activity and agricultural products, both in terms of a commodity, but also a specialized product, and really bringing access to those tools to the cannabis farming community. So we look forward to the flow of the entire research project really informing these recommendations and bringing forward specific educational tools to the community to really support everyone's understanding of intellectual property protections that are available now and what you can strive to access as prohibition continues to repeal on the federal level. And with that, I'm happy to pass it to you, Khalil, to speak to the relevance of this in the context of equity work.
Yeah, thank you, Genine. I think this really brings it home the point that I made earlier about why it's important for us to work together on this. Both of our communities have our own equity components and equity legal distinctions as it relates to California law and the definition of equity, both in the regulatory environment and the statutory environment. And we've seen how that has played out in application throughout California. And specifically talking about the use of or the manipulation of equity for folks who have not been equity and have not been harmed by the war on drugs. And an attempt to narrow that has not been successful. So we see this as another method, a framework for folks who have been involved in the cannabis industry before legalization, and even contemporarily, as Genine mentioned, in the commercial space, to protect themselves and to provide a framework or protected class of folks that doesn't rely on things that are unconstitutional under the United States Constitution or California's Constitution, specifically Prop 209. And this is a way that we can, provide additional means to protect those businesses or those individuals and their intellectual property. But we first have to identify it and then provide a framework for its legal distinction to be protected, and then apply that into the court of law or contract, however that we need to work on that. It's going to be ongoing, but this is another way for us to protect our communities.
Thanks, Khalil. And again, just want to highlight our upcoming webinar on Thursday, November 21st about Dominic's work. And again, you can register at our website and also sign up for our emailing list at legacycannabis.org. And with that, happy to move into Q&A. And so we'd like to encourage folks to please use the raised hand function, and research team will go ahead and field your questions and comments. Go ahead, AC Moon.
Good afternoon. Thank you guys so much for your hard work through the years. I've watched you enter, and each and every one of you plays such an important role. I super appreciate your energy. My biggest question right now, as somebody that's been in 25 years as a patented inventor, and I've worked with cultivars throughout the world, is how do I get involved? How can I help and be a member and support this research with articles and documentation that I've been taking since the 90s? That would be my main question, and so many questions after that, but that's the main one for right now. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, I'm happy to jump in and say we'd love to connect with you. And I think Sam, I think you guys know each other, and Sam's leading on our community engagement. And so we'd love to reach out. And then right now we're about to host some focus group meetings to build out criteria for the Community Advisory Board. And then we'll be opening up for nominations for that. So that's another opportunity to plug in. Please keep coming to the webinars, bringing your questions and your energy. Really appreciate that. And then we'll have the community meetings coming up as well. So lots of opportunities to plug in. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to hopefully getting into more documentation of all the patented cultivars that we've been working with since the early 2000s. And it seems like your guys' mission seems to be extremely applicable to mine. So thank you again for your time.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hello, how are you? First of all, group, thank you very much for this. I'm a former science publisher, and so I appreciate what you're doing immensely because you're the first bunch of PhDs I bumped into. Anyone that doesn't know me, I am a YouTuber slash documentarian slash filmmaker who ran a big hydro channel called Monster Gardens for 10 years and spent the last couple of years roaming around the Emerald Triangle making documentaries, and have just started releasing a travel series called the Seaweed Chronicles, which is all about small legacy craft farmers. I have two questions, actually. The first is very similar to the last conversation. How do I get involved? And the second is a little bit of worry, not worry, but I guess something that just popped into my head as soon as I saw this, which was Phyllis Biosciences and trying to make everyone feel better about that specific situation. We worked with those guys very briefly until they started screwing everyone, and it burned so many people. I could see that as being a potential roadblock for some. And so that's the whole IP thing. I think it's going to be answered in the next one, but I just wanted to bring it up here.
I'll take the question.
Yeah.
I think it's a really good question because it's definitely on many people's minds. And so I'm glad just to address it head on. I think the main important thing to really hold in front of you when thinking about the work that's happening in this project is that this project is really looking at documentation of plants and then using those plants to then go and move towards the genetics. So that's really the correct order of operations. And so it's really looking at using the CAB to advise the group as to what plant definitions are. And most of the work is really around vouchering and documentation, which is a resource that then the community can reference to then push questions forward.
Right.
So what Phyllis was doing was really going to the, I'm going to use a dog analogy because people get less attached to a dog analogy than they do a plant analogy. So what Phyllis was doing was really, I'm going to go to the store, the puppy store, and buy puppies that you tell me are German Shepherds, and or I'm going to the pound and I'm going to sequence every dog that I see. And if it looks like a Corgi, I'm going to call it a Corgi. Or if you tell me it's a Corgi, I'm going to call it a Corgi. The problem is this is not reference material. This is hearsay, bad labeling. I mean, I used to make the kind of tongue-in-cheek joke, garbage in, garbage out. You, as a botanist and in any kind of ID situation, you must start with appropriate reference material. So in the botanical community, there's a concept called CRM, Certified Reference Material. So if you're going to talk about echinacea or hops or apples or roses, if you're going to talk about a specific cultivar, you must, or a specific species, you must have a CRM, a certified reference material of that plant. So that's what the herbarium is acting as, is a repository for those materials, such that you can then build definitions and have tangible things you can go back to look at for whatever the questions that you can't even think of right now, you're going to have later as an organization. Does that mean if I put something in there, you can look at it? No, it's like for the community. And then you have the reference materials about cultivar where everyone just comes together and says, these are the characteristics that hold blue bottle, make up a cult, you know, whatever that plant is together. And here's a reference of something that we all agree is that thing. And so it's a very different approach. Like the concept that you can just sequence something and you own it is quite frankly ridiculous. I can go to the store and I can sequence every apple in the grocery store. It doesn't mean I own any of those apples. It doesn't mean I've even seen an apple tree that's been able to produce those apples. So that's really the difference of the approach to the work as a whole. And it's what makes it very different than the work that Phyllis was doing. I don't know if that answered your question because there's a lot to unpack with that, but I hope that answers at least some of the more broad issues with the approach and why it burned, to use your word, so many people in the long run. I'm sure we could spend, I have a whole seminar later on where I'm sure we'll get into this in more detail and with more
Perfect.
grittiness, but I think that's the easy, direct answer.
Excellent. Well, the last thing I'll quickly say is I'm releasing a pilot season of this travel series called the Seaweed Chronicles, but my eventual aim is to try and make a second season or more that will visit every legal farm in the Emerald Triangle, which is why this excited me so much. I thought maybe I can open doors, make connections where there aren't any, because it's all about outreach. And I found boots on the ground is the best way to do it. And seeing as I'm planning to try and reach everyone, what the hell? So thank you for your time and thanks for everything you're doing.
Thanks, Matt. Great to hear from you. Other questions? Folks are feeling shy. Scott.
Hi. Thank you guys for doing this whole thing. This is amazing. I guess my question would be, as we determine what cultivars would fall within the public commons, is there any aspect of the project that would be acting as a seed bank or a way for those public common cultivars to be available to the general public throughout the state?
I can take this question. I'm assuming that is okay with everybody and anyone else can jump in. That is out of the scope of this project. It is something that would be amazing and lovely. And in any other crop, that's something that the USDA would do. With a caveat saying that the USDA field station in Geneva, Zach Stencil is awesome. He's the curator of the hemp germplasm collection. You should all look him up. He does amazing work, and we can imagine as the federal landscape changes, that collection will grow to include things that are, quote, important on the cannabis side of the hemp cannabis. It's the same species dichotomy. We're just not there yet with the USDA. I think this project is fundamental because there's limited time, limited space, limited resources in any kind of organization. And this could be a very interesting way to establish what is common and what is common breeding stock that the community should have access to. And that could inform the types of plants as they grow. They would aim to steward, right? If we want somebody doing that stewardship. But it's unfortunately out of the scope of this project because it is something that's a critical need. It's something that's a huge project and it's very hard for one organization to steward that kind of germplasm collection. And generally speaking, it's something that a government agency like the USDA.
Yeah, and I think it's important to flag that, this is exactly the type of issue that we're going to identify and include in our findings, likely regarding the impacts of federal prohibition and the current policy constructs and how deeply impactful that is to, in particular, biodiversity and the health of a regulated commercial cannabis industry. So, we're really hoping that these findings will be a driver, right, for policy change.
Thank you.
Okay. Erica?
Oh, Genine, you're on. We can't hear you either. Erica, we can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
Oh,
now we can.
now.
Yeah, you can. Okay. Great. So I am a PhD candidate in the University of Nevada, Reno, and I research cannabis phytochemistry. I look at how abiotic stress changes its profile in interactions with insects. And so I was curious if you guys are going to be following, you mentioned Zach just now, so it's a good segue, the phenotyping handbook from the USDA when you're, in the herbarium and so forth.
I'm helping Zach craft that side of, because the phenotyping handbook they have doesn't
Yeah.
address things that are important in cannabis. So it's a conversation that Zach and I are currently
Okay, because I
and
researched
add
both
sections to
feral.
that phenotyping handbook.
Yeah, because I researched with feral and cultivated. You know, everything for research at the university, of course, is hemp. But I grew in Nevada County for about 15 years. So I collected a lot of insects and arthropods off of friends' gardens. And so I just listened to his webinar recently too on that. So cool. I was hoping those two would eventually, when laws change, can be melded together. So very cool.
Yeah, and also Shelby Ellison and
Yeah, I know Shelby.
She's also got some really good resources for feral hemp. So we're the herbarium is actually working with all of those groups. So Shelby's feral collections are in the Canada herbarium, as are the USDA hemp cultivars, and so it's a really good database as reference.
Yeah.
And then contextualize the cannabis, the California cannabis side of the cannabis
right
trader.
Yeah, I'm talking about a postdoc with Shelby right now. So very cool.
Well, she's rad. So
yeah, she's awesome.
Yep.
Cool. Thank you.
That's great. Other folks?
Can I pop in real quick?
Sure, go for it.
Thank you. I was, as somebody that's had dispensaries and genetics projects going since 1999, I was wondering, as I've spoken to several of you throughout the years of the 2 decades, are you using any sort of federal oversight? I know that a lot of the research that we're all doing for the different universities we're all affiliated with aren't allowing, obviously, any sort of cannabis in federally oversighted bodies, including our university bases, and that has obviously influenced our research ability for a long time. Are you taking in federal raids, or as we do the assessments and create the research and documentation, are we only allowed to focus on like the rates of like our dispensary that was in the state and by local jurisdiction and state jurisdiction, or will there be any continuity or influence gained from the actual federal rates that also happened in camaraderie with the state and local rates? I was wondering if those aspects would be applicable or are able to be applied to your guys' research and documentation currently. I know it's been a problem in the past.
If I understand your question, there sounds like there's kind of 2 things to it, but one of them is the stories people tell, it doesn't matter. Federal, state, local law enforcement impacts are absolutely going to be documented. But it does sound like there was another part of your question I didn't quite understand, which is I'm not, what is the relevance to universities being able to touch the plant exactly? Because I can't at Cal Poly Humboldt, my scope, isn't relevant to touching the plant. It's really Eleanor's. So then I'll pass it to Eleanor.
Gaining the information about basically the social economy or the which
You faded in now.
Sorry, we're headed out to the mountains to another farm. And I'm losing reception because we're going out back to the farm. So I wanted to, participate before we kept on harvesting. But I'm just trying to see if the documentation is also going to be inclusive of federal calamities that have happened, or would they be only inclusive of the state or local bodies? I'm seeing how expansive that the documentation and research would be in the way of.
Yeah, federal is absolutely included. Yeah.
Okay, great.
100%.
Excellent. Thanks so much for your guys' work. You're awesome.
Thank you.
Floor is open for folks. Don't be shy.
And if you think of questions later, our emails are available, and you can email us for sure. This is not your last chance
Thanks,
to.
Dominic.
I just have a really
Go
easy
for it.
question. I'm here on Soul Spirit Farm, so I'm representing them, but Walter definitely wants to take a look. Are you guys gonna send the video, the recording out, or is it gonna be available via email? Obviously, I took notes, but I really think there's pertinent information in here for him to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll follow up with everyone that registered and send a link, and then we're also going to post it on our website.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure. Go for it. Yep.
I had one more question. As I'm doing research for the University of Virgin Islands on Humboldt and Triangle, would it be acceptable for me to research your guys' research in the way of how you're pertaining it and then offer it to the Virgin Islands and the Caribbean so that they could possibly emulate what you're doing and extend your services to those other university bodies so that they could be using it as a map to again create their own legacy genetics on different islands? Is this something that you guys have thought about doing, is expanding these projects and your affluence that you've gained through the immense amount of work you put in to help basically gain the path for the intellectual property and genetics protection in other places? And is that something acceptable for you? Is that something I can do? Do you mind if I put out a research paper on your guys and how you guys have propelled this advocacy movement through education and declared research?
I want to let Genine mostly answer this, but in general, like, we absolutely want this to be a start. Whether it's us or other people, this is a time delimited specific research grant. And so we are hoping that, like, even just doing this opens up the research landscape, the grant landscape for further research. So I want to just say that directly, and then I'll turn it over to Genine.
Yeah, thanks, Dominic. Absolutely. I think the overarching intent here is to work to develop a model, in particular, one that really allows the community to participate as an equal partner and really drive research that meaningfully addresses needs on the ground, and which are quite acute in cannabis producing communities across the world. So that's absolutely part of the intention and the work ahead of us, and really appreciate, in the spirit of collaboration, the work that you're doing. And yeah, really appreciate the question. Ben?
Hello, thank you very much for letting me ask a question. I'm a reporter at Marijuana Moment, and one of the questions I had, I'm sorry to like sort of zoom out a little bit and ask about the rest of the world, but I'm wondering if you could just sort of explain how this project sort of fits in with other things happening around the world. Obviously, there's a lot of, I forget who used the phrase, maybe Dominic, world historical places for cannabis genetics. You know, I'm here in the Pacific Northwest. Northern Lights is a strain that I understand to have, or cultivar that is understand to have come from, my region. And I'm just kind of curious, like, whether that is things that could be replicated elsewhere, or things like this that already have started to establish kind of a canon of cannabis. How does that work? Like, sort of, what is the picture and how does this fit in? And then maybe more like personally worried, is there anything to prevent like someone in Northern California being like, yes, this Northern Lights plant, my grandfather bred it, and could there be a history grab because California is doing this project and Oregon or Washington may not be, or Vancouver, whatever,
Well, let me just say that, some of those stories will be told, in the California and other places context article. And so, I know perfectly well, the role of Washington State, Steve Murphy, and so forth. I've got some stories actually about Northern Lights. So it's not just about like California owning it, it's about the connections and how the genetics traveled, right? It's like the significance isn't just, Northern Lights, it's how Northern Lights like came into being through its connection with other places, and where it was kind of first named is certainly part of a number of people's stories. So there's some consistency in that, but also there's absolutely plenty of room for other people to come along and tell their stories as well. And for, for this is the beginning of hopefully like every place being able to tell its story, right? So I'm not too worried about Northern Lights is a legacy nomenclature that has actually like a lot of people who've told the stories, and the people who were involved in it are still alive and so forth. I don't think you have to worry about that. The story is about the connection. Northern Lights' genetics, actually came from other places too, right? Like even if Northern Light itself got bred in Washington.
Well, I also don't want to force us to only talk about one strain, but more broadly, just wanted to sort of, the connections and where they come from. That definitely answers my question. Thank you. Yeah.
If I could also jump in, Ben, the difference between hearsay and history is that it's verified, right? And so if you have one person who tells one story, that's a lot different than multiple people referencing that. And that's so developing a body of, say, oral histories allows us to begin to create that. And then when you also begin to dovetail that, say, with the science that Eleanor does, right? That adds to that verification. And so and I think that's also really important, which is, again, I value journalists, particularly old school journalists who do the research and they're out there and doing good stuff like yourself. So, but I also think, so this is what allows that then to also bleed into other areas outside of history. And so then, we have a much more educated and verifiable kind of discussion of how things came to be. So as Dominic said, this is a start.
Yeah, and I just want to add a couple of things. This is what I, as a little science nerd, thinks is the most beautiful thing about this project is you have the constellation of histories and tracing how plants have moved between communities. And then you can overlay the science as kind of a bullshit detector, right? If you have 10 people saying that we're just going to run with Northern Lights because it's a good example. One person said, this is the original creator. They gave it to these 3 people. These 3 people passed it along. It was sold here at this point in time. Then all of a sudden you can look at many different points. And it's like those little kids' book. Out of these 9 things, which 8 are alike, and you can really see, all of these hold together and hold the story together and all match up. And this one doesn't actually fit. And so you can kind of weave some of the hyperbole out of the story using the science, while also corroborating the stories using the science. And so it's a really nice way to tie those 2 things together. And also just to speak about California, and I think you need to think about California more as a trade center than as we're only focusing on California cannabis. Right? Because California, regardless if you are from California as a breeder, you have interacted with California as a cannabis breeder. Like whether it's through Californians moving to Europe or, it's been such an epicenter of trade. It's kind of like when you study the Vikings, you've got to study certain cities. And it's not because they're necessarily even in Scandinavia, it's because those people were there all the time. And so it's sort of the same thing with the cannabis in my mind. When I think about California, it's really just, it's the epicenter of cannabis genetic diversity. And that's because of the intersections and the movements of people that have come and gone through this particular zone of the planet and have gone everywhere else too.
Thanks. That also helps me understand your earlier distinction between the plant and the genetics, because it does seem like what you're talking about is like the provenance of an object and not just the clonable code inside its DNA or whatever. So thanks. That's really helpful.
Great. We've got time for a couple more questions. Yeah, agreed. Yeah, thank you, man, so much. Other questions from folks?
as we're close to time, I just want to emphasize that we're at the beginning of something. We got to start somewhere, right? And on the historical side, every history is subject to further validation and reinterpretation, revision as we go along. But hopefully what we do inspires many other people to do this work as well as ourselves continue to do the work going forward.
Thanks, Dominic. Well said.
I was totally going to chime in with some similar things earlier, and Todd covered it, then Eleanor covered it, and then there you go, Dominic. It topped it off so perfectly. Really well.
I have a quick question. I just can't find the hand raise, if I can jump in.
Go for it, Kate. Yeah.
So I know you're going to be I think you said the project timeline is several years, but the workshops and meetings are going to be happening all throughout that. But I guess I'm curious about how much of the research and project is going to be kind of shared along the way, or how you're kind of thinking about providing updates, or, is there going to be a big launch with all the oral histories at the end, or if there's any insight into that at this juncture?
Sure. Yeah, happy to field that. Thanks for coming, Kate. It's great to connect with you here. So our community events are going to be starting at the beginning of the year and moving pretty aggressively throughout this next year. And our project website is really the clearinghouse for information. So we're going to be updating that on a regular basis. So as publications are coming out, white papers, educational information, we'll be posting that regularly to the website. We'll have our events calendar there so folks can really track in real time and connect via webinars and the community events. And then we're going to close out the project, which is, it's going to close out about mid to late year in 2026, and we have a dissemination event. And right now we're proposing to do that in Sacramento so we can try and reach the policymaker community in California with these, policy findings as well. So that's kind of generally what we've got laid out in terms of community engagement, outreach, and opportunities for the public to plug in.
Okay, thanks. I'm just excited to hear more. So it's helpful to get a sense of that. And thanks for doing
Absolutely.
these.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. We've got a couple of questions in the chat if folks want to field that. One from Dharma, two from Dharma actually. First question, are you going to use the categorization of type 1, 2, 3, i.e. THC rich, mixed CBD rich?
I mean, we'll take in all that information. I think a lot of those categories are codified in such a way that they're part of the common way we discuss about these plants. So that information will be taken in that way for those plants where it's applicable, which is.
And I assume that's probably true for the second question in terms of categorizing terpenes. Will flavonoids be looked at? Great to see that pest resistance and climate conditions, those pieces as well.
Yeah, and remember, we're not doing any direct experimentation on those things. And so there'll be the intake when you're intaking about the characteristics of those plants, that'll be self-reported. There'll be a subset of plants that are looked at for chemistries to answer specific questions, but it will not by any stretch be all of the plants that are intaked. That's just an insurmountable amount of money to squeeze out of the DCC. So we'll start where we're at, and that will hopefully springboard more grants and more monies to start diving into those really important agricultural questions, which are really beyond the scope of any one organization to do all of the legwork to uplift, is what an ag research station would generally do. But it's a good springboard to get some of those basic pieces of information together to be able to ask for more monies to do the work.
And then one last question before we close. Melissa asked, what's the time commitment for the work on the farmer side? And I really appreciate this question, Melissa. And I think it really depends how folks are plugging in. So there's many different ways that farmers can plug in. For example, serving on the community advisory board, does provide an honorarium for people's time, and we're trying to be really conscious as we shape that to be conscientious of people's availability in terms of those folks advising the research team for the rest of the project. And in terms of the research, I think, love to just pass it to my colleagues because I think it really just depends on, what folks are participating in.
So just typically, the time involved with scheduling and conducting a 90-minute interview is kind of the baseline. It does involve usually preliminary conversation first. So on my side of things, it's, generally, a fairly low time commitment.
Yeah, I'd say with the oral history, I mean, we do a lot more meetings prior, and there's a little more time involvement in that. Usually my sessions last about 2 hours, and for some it may be depending on that interview, which is what we discuss. Sometimes we may even have to go into 3-4 hours, depending. But for this project, that'll be a little bit more limited. So roughly around 2 hours, and maybe a couple hours before that in regards to meetings in regards to discussing what we're going to cover, and also reviewing the outlines and things like that. So
yeah, and when it comes to plan intake, it's really, we try to make this as streamlined as possible. It really depends on the number of plants that you're vouchering, the timelines. We're doing this in community events so that you come prepared. We're going to prepare you how to do that so that it's very streamlined, and then documents that you can fill in either online or in person that get at phenotypic characteristics that are associated with those pressings. So it should be very streamlined if people are doing their homework before they get there.
Great, thanks everyone. Well, happy to close our webinar now, and really appreciate everyone coming out, and looking forward to getting this recording out and sharing the information broadly. And please do join us on Thursday, the 21st of November for Dominic's webinar, and that'll be at noon. And again, you can go ahead to our website at legacykannabis.org and register for that now. Really appreciate everyone's time. Thank you so much for the discussion.